change opinion. But we also see a lot of differences among different blocks of the electorate, and importantly, I point to race and age. And so I think, probably unsurprisingly, young Americans are most favorable towards legalization of cannabis, both for medical and recreational use. We see 71% in recent polling, 18 to 29-year-olds, saying that they would favor medical and recreational use nationwide. But when we look at older generations, that support dips closer to the 40s. So there's some clear generational divides, but I think that something important to take away here is that over time, Gen Z, millennials will continue making up larger swaths of the American public, of the electorate, and will have a really big voice to say on this issue.
So I think that that's a really important point, right? Because the young people are really disengaged from politics right now. We know that that's the case. And so cannabis could actually be the issue that gets young people to the polls, right? Both major parties really need those young people, and young people on the left and the right agree on this. This is the issue. Do you want to speak to that a little?
Sure, yeah. Thank you, Kat. The other thing I would add, I think, just in terms of the context, is prohibition of marijuana or cannabis or drugs in general is not something that goes back to the beginning of this country. This is something that happened in the last 50 years. And people, I think, have just witnessed the devastation that it's created. And that's been a big part of the culture change, in addition to all the points Courtney that you made. So young voters obviously have been very core to the Democratic coalition. But as you noted, there's, to the extent Republicans are more divided on issues of legalization or more supportive of legalization for medical purposes, more so of recreational, there are real divides within the GOP bloc, younger voters in particular. So, yeah, and I would say, disengaged, and even more so than disengaged, younger voters, I think, are really disaffected. Not to quibble over words, but these are, I think, young people who, in some ways, are very politically engaged, very active. They've been told to vote harder for election after election, and we have a hard time. This is not what we're talking about here, but there have been plenty of studies for some time that would show that we're not really functioning democracy in that way. So they're looking for other ways to affect change. And one of those ways that where we've seen increases in turnout is when legalization has been on the ballot. And in the states, you can see it has not been the case in every single one, but more often than not, an increase in voter turnout when they have a chance to vote directly on these issues.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because I think part of the problem a lot of times is, we get promised that a certain candidate is going to do all of these big things, and then it doesn't necessarily happen, right? So is there a difference here with issue-based campaigns specifically around marijuana legalization or decriminalization compared to candidate politics when it comes to this? Are people responding to one or the other?
Yeah, I think what is challenging still with the topic of marijuana legalization is that there are a lot of issues today that are preoccupying Americans' minds. Inflation is a very big issue for folks, public safety and crime. And so they're weighing a lot of these different topics the same way that campaigns weigh a lot of different topics. So I think that actually with the issue campaigns, they can do a very important job of centering that issue and making that their number one communication to help amplify policy that candidates might have and might not have the time to amplify every single stop on their lane of the race.
And let's talk about how they do that. Is there certain messaging that you find is really resonating, and does it resonate differently with, say, young voters versus older voters? Is there one right message?
Sure. I think what's great is we have a lot of opportunities in how to message effectively on this issue. One that I think spans generation, spans demographic, is the idea that it helps put money back into people's communities by legalizing cannabis. And so that you see majorities of Americans think that that is an important impact of legalization. Another is, of course, medical use. And I think that that's probably top of mind, that people, I think, through both, mostly, I think, through experience, seeing people in their families, friends, community, using cannabis for medical purposes, are starting to see that this is not just a recreational drug. This is something that is, very important to people's medical lives. And so I think that has helped a lot, and when we center that messaging, it helps quite a bit. There's also opportunity in talking about public safety and criminal justice reform. I think that Americans see that there's a clear correlation between legalization and creating a fairer criminal justice system in America as well.
So let's go back to, you talked a little bit about the history of the polling numbers here, right? And I think this is really interesting. When California first really started pushing this off with the dispensaries and things like that, people started seeing imagery of AIDS patients, like end-of-life AIDS patients getting arrested and pulled out in these raids and things like that. I think that's what really changed the national conversation. And then increasingly, as these laws have been passed, people were saying like, oh, you're going to see people smoking marijuana around you, and then you're going to lose support for this. But what we've actually seen is the more we legalize, the more support there is for legalization, right?
Correct.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think Colorado obviously was a watershed. And for all of these things, it's the fear mongering, the language that we campaign against. And as you said, it's people are experiencing it, they're either visiting it or they've been in these states. I mean, at this point, as you said,
It's not this terrifying, horrible thing.
It's not terrifying.
And it's also not these like stoner jokes that you see in like the 90s movies.
Right,
No, I mean, people's grandmas are using cannabis today.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, we did work in the Colorado campaign, and so the landscape has shifted a lot, but it was important then for some groups of voters who were more on the fence about it, to emphasize, as you said, the tax revenue and what that tax revenue can go towards, education in particular, for moms and school-age children who were worried about the consequences, so that was important to assuage them. The messengers also, so having, not only law enforcement, but centering law enforcement voices, because they do tend to be deferred to a lot on these sorts of matters, can also reassure voters. And then we've been looking at messaging around rescheduling and reclassifying, and what's been really strong there is emphasizing that the states are going to have different policies, but there ought to be national guardrails, so we should not be able to be arrested from walking from one state to the next because of different laws in years.
So let's talk a little bit about this messaging. Is there certain messaging that advocates should avoid? Is it called flat? Is there certain messaging that maybe gets certain communities excited but turns off other communities? What are sort of some of the pitfalls that we should be looking at when it comes to messaging around this?
I think one of the biggest pitfalls is giving, platform to the opposition's false claims. And it's very rudimentary, it's very outdated claims about marijuana use. And so really,
it's going to make holes in grammar.
Exactly, I think it's really important to stay focused on the messaging for legalization rather than having to constantly reply to the opposition, because we already have, as you mentioned, a very strong majority support for legalization in this country. And as Daniel said, I think a lot of people just need to better understand, what does legalization look like for my community in reality? What are those benefits beyond just use, whether that's revenue, whether that's creating safer environments. I think really emphasizing and staying focused on the benefits is important for messaging.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the other potential pitfall, although I don't see this as a great one, but especially with regard to reclassifying or rescheduling, it's just two things. One, not everybody, even people who are aware of the schedule, are not very clear on how it works. And it's easy to get people confused on that. They're just not doing the half step, right? And then, so kind of related to that,
not legalization. So what we're pushing for is full descheduling. What are you seeing in the polling for descheduling?
Well, we have looked at either legalization or rescheduling. We haven't looked at full descheduling and legalization. And that's the numbers that you said, which are really high and, you know, in some ways even higher sometimes than you see. I haven't seen a lot of public polling where we've done some internal work on rescheduling, and there's minimal opposition. I mean, it's like almost 60% support, less than 20% opposed, more than a third of any subgroup of data we oppose rescheduling. But it starts to get more complex with people, you know, we've been talking about. So there's some people who kind of hang back until they learn more. Nobody thinks that cannabis should be treated the same as heroin or fentanyl or a range of other drugs they see as more serious. So there are ways to kind of shortcut the conversation, but yeah, I mean it's solid majority support. You know, as Courtney said, there's really cuts across demographic and regional lines.
And it cuts across party lines too.
A lot,
right?
lines, yeah.
This is something that it's at the center of our 420 community. It's that it's not a left issue, it's not a right issue, it's a freedom issue. And folks on both sides of the aisle, Democrats, Republicans, are advancing legislation. They're interested in this issue. Their supporters want it, right? Is there a difference in the messages or the types of things that they're looking at or that motivates them? Is there a way to, is there stuff that you're seeing in the polling about how we should be talking to these two audiences differently, or they kind of all want the same thing?
I think when we're thinking about messaging towards conservative Americans who are the least likely to support legalization, though still I encourage members of them that you support. I think leaning into the economic revenue is a very easy way to meet them where they're already very focused. And I think also in talking about safety too, making it very clear that legalization is actually helping regulate safe use. It helps get over some of that. That's the main talking point for the opposition, that it's just going to lead to widespread drug use in unsafer communities.
Right, it's going to bring the cartels out, and of course, we know it's the opposite.
Exactly, I think so. So point to that, I think would be effective.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's right. I think there's also a synergy across not just this issue, but abortion rights and voting rights. Not all of those issues are going to animate the more, not necessarily conservatives, but kind of the more libertarian folks on the right, who I think are, you know, very sanguine about legalization. But there's a way, I think, to bracket some of these issues and talk about the attack on freedoms and how we can remedy that.
So I wanna have time for people in the audience to ask questions. But first, I'm gonna put you on the spot because you brought up something that I'm personally very interested in. So in Ohio, we had Ohio Measure 2, and at the same time we had Measure 1, right? And so what was interesting to me is to see this patchwork. So these are the marijuana legalization and also abortion measures that went to the ballot. And so it was really interesting to see the demographic breakdowns of who was voting for what, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, and we did some work on the abortion end of that, but there was, I mean, we saw in terms of the turnout a real synergy in terms of younger voters, women who were coming out and voting yes on both, or supportive of both. One of the main spokespeople or messengers for the abortion rights measure were doctors also. And I think that, you know, I don't know for a fact because again, we're more focused on one than the other. I'm really happy to see the outcomes both, but I think having, you know, medical professionals who speak to this reassures them.
That ties back to what you were saying, Courtney, with, you know, people really focusing on that medical side of things and the safety.
Yeah, I will say that in a lot of the research that we do, we find that people trust two types of people often. It's the professionals, so doctors, They trust their word greatly. They also trust their community too. And so hearing people that look like them who come from their community talk about this issue, why it's important, I think is also a really great way for them to kind of better trust and understand legalization too.
Well, I have a lot of questions for our panelists, and I can keep doing this, but I want to give some space for folks in the audience. Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask here today? I see one right there.
Yes.
I think they are going to bring you a stick mic so that the folks watching back home can hear you as well. And please keep it to a question, not a speech.
Thank you. We were having a conversation this morning about this, and obviously descheduling is like the ultimate goal. And I kind of pushed back and said, well, can our government really make that big leap? Is it, do they have to maybe take the baby steps into rescheduling? And I just wonder what your thoughts are on, like, can we move them straight to descheduling? Do we see a need to go through this process?
So I want to give both my panelists a minute to speak on this, but I have some thoughts, so I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here. So we just had a press conference this morning where we had sitting members of Congress calling in front of the cameras for descheduling. So I think there is some